Well, thank you, everyone. I'm really grateful to Coface for inviting me to speak today and to all of you for attending. My name's Richard Mallinson. I work for a firm called Energy Aspect, and what we do is we look primarily at energy markets, and I focus on how geopolitical risk impacts those markets. But what I want to do today is look a little more broadly than just energy markets, because I think the audience we've got here and in the other venues has quite a wide range of interests. And I want to take you on a quick tour of 3 different regions, and through that hopefully illustrate what I think are 3 important themes about geopolitical risk that have been developing in recent years and are going to be important to your businesses if you trade internationally and to the world in terms of politics, in terms of the direction we head over the next few years. Now, given we're in an election year in the US, I want to start in the Americas. There's plenty going on, so I'm going to focus on 3 different countries here. With the US election, it was, of course, tempting just to put Donald Trump's face up here, leave it at that. But what I did in the interests of balance and fairness is try to find the most similar pictures of the 3 candidates I could. What I want to illustrate here, of course, we've already seen conventional wisdom about this election upended. We started and we were told that Donald Trump had no chance of success. He was going to quickly flame out. He was saying things that were too controversial. We then went on to be told that whilst Hillary Clinton had the Democratic nomination sewn up, we were going into a contested Republican convention. We were going to be going at least to July with uncertainty about who the Republican candidate is. Those haven't proved to be the case so far. We know almost certainly as of this week that it will be Hillary Clinton, but the indications from Bernie Sanders, at least immediately after the most recent primaries, were that he wants to carry on. He wants to go into that Democratic convention in Philadelphia still contesting. And I think the reason for this is not that he any longer expects to be able to clinch the nomination, but it's that he knows his candidacy, his position as a political outsider, is influencing the positions that Hillary Clinton will take going into November. It's influencing the tone of the debate. And that same thing is true of Donald Trump, whether or not he wins this election. And we absolutely cannot rule that out anymore. But what's important is we've seen the debate shift, the topics, and also the positions of the candidates. And just to take a couple of issues, international trade, the big trade deals that the US is looking at, considering at the moment, TTIP, TPP, Hillary Clinton has moved her stance on those topics. She may, over the course of the main campaign, and then if she were to be elected, she might shift back, but I think it won't be back to her original positions, very open, very welcoming to these deals, because we're seeing more isolationist views. We're seeing more concerns about the risks and impact for the US economy, for US workers, of interconnection, of interaction with the rest of the world. So that takes us into foreign policy, another area where I think we're seeing shifts in position, less willingness to talk about both openness, interaction, but also criticism of the foreign policy under Obama, which of course Hillary Clinton was a key architect of as Secretary of State, the Iran nuclear deal, which I'll come on to, and other areas. And I think what that means and what that points towards is a very different kind of foreign policy, or an incrementally different kind of foreign policy after this election from the US. And to pick out, I think we're going to see different tools and techniques being used, particularly around economic statecraft. This is something that's become very popular in the wake of the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, all of the consequences that flowed from them. It's looking for a lower cost, less controversial way to exert influence to be a global superpower through sanctions, through trade pressure, through other channels. And there is a very active debate about how successful that approach actually is. If we have a Trump presidency, then we hear about much more direct, walls being built with Mexico, bans on certain kinds of immigration. Perhaps those policies change, perhaps they're implemented as they stand now. But it's again primarily about the US economy, isolating it, protecting it from other parts of the world and what are perceived as threats, and then secondly, using economic power as a tool of diplomacy, as a tool of statecraft. And the final thing I'll say here on the US is I think the fact that this election has already gone against all of the predictions means that going into 2020, many more candidates from different backgrounds, from different starting points, are going to consider their chances. So it opens up the field of what has always been a very set Democrat versus Republican political landscape. And that creates a lot more uncertainty for us, looking at how we engage with the US, looking at the direction that US policy might head. But on that point of economic statecraft and sanctions as a policy tool, my next country, Venezuela, is one of those areas where the US has considered, tentatively started trying to use sanctions, but really to little effect. So last year, as the Maduro government used increasingly harsh tactics to clamp down on opposition protesters, we saw the US impose sanctions on 7 individuals, travel bans, asset freezes, in an attempt to try and sway or influence the direction of the domestic political crisis. But in a country that has long been seemingly on the brink of financial disaster, these moves may have actually been counterproductive, because rather than speeding up a transition to an opposition government, rather than helping, what this actually gave at the margins was an opportunity for the Maduro government to blame the US for more of the internal problems, the economic mismanagement. Repeatedly, what we see is Maduro and other key officials talking about this US imperialist policy being the reason that Venezuela's economy is such a disaster. Now, that's certainly not the case, but I think it just picks out one of the limits of trying to use sanctions as a tool to effect the change that you want to see in a particular country. Now, where does Venezuela head? We've been seeing predictions that Venezuela will collapse economically for years. And absolutely, on any measure, there are huge problems, there's a huge crisis, and it's worsening. I think there are 2 possible or increasingly likely routes that we might head, with quite different consequences for the international trade with Venezuela beyond. One of them would be that the opposition manages, either with its recall referendum or in the elections over the next couple of years, to slowly grapple power away from the Chavismo movement. The second, though, is that within Maduro's own party, his unpopularity leads to a coup, he's sidelined, people try and pin the blame on him, and therefore maintain and resuscitate the leadership's grasp on power. And it really isn't clear-cut which one of those might happen. But I think it's only through the opposition movement coming to power and then a series of very painful economic reforms that we might see the kind of opening up, the kind of opportunities for economic involvement, for more trade, for a more positive direction for Venezuela's economy. But of course, apart from some businesses, apart from some sectors such as oil, where having long protected and really prioritized the oil sector, Venezuela is starting to show cracks. We've seen production falling for a number of reasons, and most recently we've seen big oil field services companies, Schlumberger and others, announce that they are no longer going to work in the country because of unpaid arrears, because of the consequences of the financial crisis. But beyond that, there may not be that many people here who are directly exposed to Venezuela. So let's go on to a much bigger Latin American economy, Brazil. A few years ago, we were looking at a great success story driven by the commodities boom, one of the BRICS, remember that group? And what we saw and what we have seen over the last couple of years is a dramatic turnaround. Parts of it will be very familiar, the collapse in oil prices and other commodities, but combined with that, the corruption scandal, which started with the state oil firm Petrobras and has expanded, it's moved up to the level where it's led to the impeachment of President Rousseff. So with this, all of these elements together, political corruption, economic downturn, you might expect to see the kind of insurgency, the kind of outsiders emerging on the political scene that we've seen with the US, that we're seeing in other parts of the world. But in fact, that doesn't appear to be happening yet. What we have with the impeachment is the transition to Vice President Temer, centre-right, another established figure in Brazilian politics. And so far, at least, there's little evidence from the people I speak to in Brazil of real insurgent movements, real outsider politics. And I think this chart on the right tells you a little bit about why that's the case. What happened under the Workers' Party over a number of years, first with President Lula and which President Rousseff tried to continue, was a huge rebalancing between the wealthy and the poor in Brazil, which had gained this incredible Gini coefficient, this incredible gap between the richest and the poorest. And that has generated and established a lot of ground support for the main party. Even with all of this scandal, all of this problems at the moment, it will be difficult for an outsider to come in to tap into the frustrations based on current evidence. Now, does the impeachment, does the replacement of Rousseff point to a rapid improvement? There has been some optimism, some hope that Brazil is about to turn a corner. But it's fair to say Temer's first few weeks have not been error-free, they've not been problem-free. He's already lost 2 ministers caught up in the corruption scandal, and it's unclear whether he can move beyond this crisis, whether he can chart a new course, whether he can try and get the Brazilian economy back on track. Certainly, at the moment, we're probably at a nadir, but the question is whether we start to see a pickup and improvement, or we flatline along at this low point. So having covered one region, I want to move to quite a different region now, much closer to home, much more developed than Latin America in most parts, and I want to talk about 3 different issues here as well. Brexit, quite a lot's already been said this morning. I'm not going to try and forecast which way it's going to go. That's proving very tricky at the moment with the polling, and much like the US, where conventional wisdom has proved a less effective guide as we move into these new turbulent political times. I think that may well be the case with the polls around referendum. But I just want to pick out 2 things here. The first is that I think when we think back to why are we having this referendum, what was the trigger, we can see an influence of an insurgent, a political outsider, in the shape of UKIP and Nigel Farage. Remember back to the run-up to the 2015 election, UKIP's popularity was surging, there was real pressure on David Cameron, who was already in coalition government. And in an effort to reunite his party, in an effort to deal with the loss of voters to UKIP, he promised a referendum. Of course, he then went on to win an unexpected majority, to do quite well in the 2015 election, but he's left with this referendum, which is now causing huge problems within the Conservative Party in terms of cabinet ministers on both sides of the debate, on both sides of the campaign, and also creates a huge element of uncertainty for the wider British economy. But the second thing I just want to highlight is, given how close the polls suggest we are, we may come down to events that are beyond the debate, that are beyond the immediate, because there's so little reliable information. There's so much claim and counterclaim about the economic effects, about the consequences of a Brexit. It could well come down to events, to news headlines in the next few weeks as to which way the public does turn. And one of those key themes and one of those topics which is certainly having an impact is, of course, the debate over migration, immigration, and the refugee crisis that's going on throughout Europe. And I think, again, this has been talked about a little bit already today. But what we're seeing with this huge flow of migrants and refugees, with all the intermingling of different groups, is that there's a massive political knock-on effect. It's a strain and a test not only for the European institutions, the policies that the EU had in place for dealing with immigration and refugees and asylum seekers, but also for the international treaties and conventions. These are really not equipped to handle the kinds of numbers and the kinds of pace of flows that we're currently seeing. And what are we seeing as a result? we're seeing the support for outsider parties, for far-right nationalist movements being further boosted. Most of these parties already existed, they already had a core of support, but as we saw with the recent Austrian elections for president, where it came down to a fraction of a percent between a Green candidate and between a far-right candidate, there is a much, much bigger groundswell of frustration, of anger, of fear, whatever you want to label it as, emerging as a consequence, at least in part, of the asylum crisis. And I don't think that is going to fade, and I don't think it's easy to predict what knock-on effects it will have for the European project, what knock-on effects it will have for the countries which are seeing the biggest political shifts. And then another challenge that Europe has been dealing with over the last couple of years is how to cope and how to respond to Russia's intervention in Ukraine, President Putin's continued assertive policies. I think we had the headlines yesterday about a Russian submarine being escorted. It was very polite naval language for having been spotted where it shouldn't be. But what we think about with Ukraine is, again, economic statecraft. We had Russia involved in Ukraine, pretty obviously leading and driving a lot of the violence in eastern Ukraine, taking control of Crimea. And yet, this wasn't felt to be sufficient to prompt a direct military response. Certainly, NATO forces were moved closer to the borders, a lot was said, but the US, the EU try to use sanctions as a tool, as a response. How successful has it been? Well, certainly, between that and falling oil prices, the Russian economy, the Russian currency, had a disastrous time through 2014, 2015. But a few interesting things are happening now. We've seen the ruble stabilize. And in fact, the fall in the ruble helped the domestic oil sector. Costs became cheaper, but it was still coming in dollars, which were suddenly worth more. So actually, Russian oil companies have been amongst the least punished by the fall in oil prices in relative terms. We also saw Russia respond with its own sanctions. At first, this seemed spiteful and self-defeating because they cut off imports of mainly fruit and vegetables from the EU, and prices domestically spiked. But what has received less attention is that at the same time, Russia put about $38 billion into policies to promote import substitution, investments in a wide range of Russian sectors, some of which are paying off, in particular in agriculture, many of which simply aren't, because the Russian economy cannot easily replace out the high-end, high-value, complex products it's been importing that have become more expensive. But through those policies and in the sectors where it's working, the nature and the shape of the Russian economy is shifting. And even at the point when these sanctions are potentially lifted, that may mean that we don't see the original trade patterns returning. Russian domestic firms may have actually used this opportunity, used the government largesse as a way to displace and position themselves to be better competitors for European and other imports. And the other thing, of course, the purpose of these sanctions was to try and make Putin rethink his policies, at an extreme, potentially try and even put his political position into doubt. Do we see that? Well, the chart on the right, which is from an independent polling organisation and shows his popularity, suggests not. He remains fantastically popular, in part because there really isn't much in the way of an alternative. I don't think you'd get very far being an insurgent candidate trying to challenge Putin in Russia, and I think, sadly, a few who have tried have met unfortunate ends because of that, or maybe not because of that. I should watch what I say as well. But has he changed his policies? Has he become less assertive? It doesn't seem so. Yes, the Russian economy has suffered hugely. But again, because of sanctions, he's been able to lay the blame on the people and on the countries imposing the sanctions rather than take the responsibility and say, yes, our own policies, our own decisions have led to these problems. So a few threads and themes emerging here, and I want to pick out one last region and then tie it all together before we go into the group discussion. And this is the Middle East and North Africa region, very close to my heart, given all of the energy implications, given all of all that's going on there geopolitically as well. And I want to start Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, of course, Iran is often used as the case for why sanctions work. We have an Iranian nuclear deal, which is a very positive development for regional stability, for relations between Iran and the West, but it is, of course, narrowly focused on reducing the threat of Iran gaining nuclear weapons. And the argument goes that Iran only came to the table because of increasingly tightening sanctions. But evidence is emerging that Iran and the US were having back-channel communications before the appointment of President Rouhani, before potentially even the tightening of sanctions in 2012. It doesn't mean that the sanctions didn't play a role, but the question is how much of a role, and could it have been achieved without? Because once again, what Iran's economy has done, along with feeling a lot of pain, and you can see that in terms of the red here, so all of the knock-on effects on GDP and on imports from the period of sanctions. But again, the Iranian economy has adapted. Ayatollah Khamenei had a very famous phrase called the resistance economy, that they would respond to sanctions by making the Iranian economy stronger. And interestingly, this is IMF projections, by the way, when we look at what happens now in the view of the forecasters, and this assumes a relatively steady oil price rather than a big recovery, we see a big jump in Iranian imports this year, next year, as they bring in things like airline parts, as they really benefit from that sanctions relief. But then we move to a level where Iranian GDP growth performs better than the Saudi economy, which hasn't had that kind of period of adaptation, which is very much exposed to oil prices, and also to a relatively low level of import growth. And again, the idea is that perhaps the Iranian economy isn't as dependent, isn't as open to imports as it might have been without that period of sanctions. And we'll see as well with the banking and transaction issues that are still facing many businesses that do want to re-enter Iran, whether those sanctions are going to have a long legacy effect, because although many have been lifted, there are others which certainly remain in place, particularly for US firms, but actually the complexity is for any businesses that have US personnel, that have a US branch, you really need to pour through an extensive and complex architecture of residual sanctions. But beyond just Iran, because it doesn't exist in isolation, we have the dynamic between Iran and Saudi Arabia, two of the big powerhouses in the region, and with the troubles facing Egypt, increasingly the two biggest players in the Islamic world. So what do those tensions mean? Well, one of the things I think is a knock-on of the Iran deal has been an increase in tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We've also seen other factors. So, of course, we've seen the legacy of the Arab uprisings. We've seen the destabilization of countries like Syria, Yemen, parts of North Africa, all of which has fueled this sense on both sides that the other regional power is trying to impose its influence, is working behind the scenes to destabilize the sort of allies, be it Saudi Arabia seeing Iran's hand in every conflict or Iran seeing Saudi Arabia's. But also, we've seen the Saudis concerned that with the US reopening ties to Iran, the relationship that it had with Washington is weakening. And we've seen a big transition within the Saudi leadership. King Abdullah was replaced at the beginning of last year by King Salman. His son in particular, the Deputy Crown Prince, hugely influential, is shifting Saudi economic policy, foreign policy very rapidly. All of this, I think, points to a situation where, whilst I don't expect a direct confrontation, a direct conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran in the next 3 to 5 years, I think their regional tensions, the standoff, the indirect conflicts that they have through proxies will really be defining features and will perpetuate the instability in many parts of the Middle East. And we see that playing out in lots of different aspects, lots of different angles. One of the areas it's playing out least, in fact, although a little bit, is in terms of the oil markets itself. In a way, they both have so much to lose if oil prices stay low, if they knock each other out of that market in some way, that they're preferring to find other avenues, other mechanisms. But where and how that happens, I think one of the keys is through the militant groups, through the different forces and factions in unstable countries that they are sponsoring. And that's playing a part in what we're seeing across North Africa. Starting in Libya, we have a real outpost, an influential outpost for Islamic State, the militant group. That's really diminished Libyan oil production along with other complex rivalries. It's also, I think, fed into an arc of instability that extends across northern Africa, certainly to Algeria and Egypt and Tunisia. And one of the big knock-ons for trade has been the tourism sector. A series of different attacks, a series of different events and concerning headlines in terms of what's happening in Egypt, despite the appointment of a new authoritarian ruler who started as a general, has now become an elected president. Despite that, we've seen tourism numbers continue to struggle, most recently with the tragedy with the Sinai Egypt airplane back in November. And I think what this points towards is you can't contain militancy easily within one unstable country. It has spillover. And that, again, coming back to an earlier theme about the asylum-seeker refugee crisis in Europe, is one of the big fears for European policymakers, given the prominence of these groups in Libya in particular, given their involvement in the smuggling networks. Might some militants, might some threats come across the Mediterranean, come into Europe? And that is appearing in the public dialogue as well. So all of this, I think, it's hard to see where and how you start rebuilding some of the states in this region that have become so fragmented, that have become so complex, because a lot of the groups who are interested in having influence are directly rivaling one another and therefore may not see much gain from stabilizing, from bringing kind of compromise between the different factions, at least as long as they think that they can push their agenda and their kind of proxy groups can dominate, can triumph. So sadly, I think many of these conflicts are going to be with us for many years and are going to continue evolving and metastasizing because of external input as well as because of what's going on within the countries themselves. So just to wrap up, I've talked a little bit about political insurgents, political outsiders. And I think what's interesting for them is they appear much more in the developed economies than we're seeing in the much less stable or much more developing regions. I've talked a bit about economic sanctions and the fact that I think despite its mixed track record in the countries that it's been tried, and as one more example, look at Cuba, 40 years of sanctions, no real shift in policy. But despite that, they're an increasingly popular and prominent tool of diplomacy. And finally, I've talked a little bit about militant groups, which I think are emerging in some of the most troubled and fragmented states, and which I think are a transnational threat. So even if you don't operate in the states where they're most prominent, you can't necessarily isolate yourself easily from the risk and the threat that they posed. And with those three themes in your mind, I'm going to pass this on to, I think, Frederick to introduce the panel discussion.